Hey, what's up, guys? So today I wanted to make kind of a future in Wizard101 video, something that I've been seeing going on and something I've been experiencing myself. Now, for those of you guys who know me, I am someone who's been playing this game for a long time. I've been very vocal about this change and how I see the game going in the future, about, specifically referring to dual schooling and how I didn't think it was positive for the game and how I thought that it would, completely kill the player base. But to be completely honest, since they started implementing these changes, the dual schooling themselves is not the reason the players has been shrinking. It's for other reasons. But, recently I've been playing in the dual circle competitive tournament in which life is kind of forced to play dual schooling. And after, giving it a fair try and experimenting with it, I can safely say that dual schooling is actually way more fun than I expected. But the issue is with the current meta of the game, there's a lot of things that need to change. So that is what I'm going to be going over in this video, specifically referring to dual schooling. So for those of you guys who know, the most probably popular two dual schooling strats was storm hitting on an ice, which was, plaguing the last 2 seasons ago in PvP, and then myth hitting on a fire. So those two were kind of the most popular, but there are some very, you know, obvious distinctions between these two. So, there's kind of a misconception with dual schooling themselves, and this is something I find myself in a little bit as well, specifically on defensive schools. So, as you guys know, most of the time, defensive schools have a hard time getting Pierce, specifically Ice and Life. Even if you run like full out, most Pierce you can get on a Life or an Ice, the most you're getting is usually like 43 or 44, compared to like Storm and Fire and Myth, who can get upwards to past, 55 with just running normal gear. So that is a big problem when it comes to dual schooling, because if you're giving up stats for life to be able to dual school with schools like Fire, you're going to end up having even worse Pierce. And having, 30, 28 Pierce on a life kind of defeats the entire purpose of dual schooling, because you're going to be hitting into 65, 66 resist consistently. And if you only have 28 Pierce, you're not going to be doing damage, and it's not worth it at that point. So as you can see on my life, I'm running a Fire, basically mono schooling setup. As you can see, I have 11k HP, 176 damage, 66 res, perfect accuracy for Fire. Crit is terrible, which is something I'll get into later. Good block, 45 Pierce, and 80 outgoing. Now this is what was my setup for the dual school tournament and dual circle. But you get the point. I have really good Fire stats, but when it comes to life, I have 136 damage and only, 13 Pierce, because I had to give up all of my sockets for Fire Pierce. So while I'm on a life, I can't use life hitting spells. So this is a big issue that I think in the future, one way to mitigate this issue is to try to move away from pretty much every school just running their own school Pierce sockets. If you make it to where, the gear gets enough Pierce so that you don't have to run 3 circle sockets on every school, that would be an interesting way to go about it. The big issue with this is there's really no good way, because there's still going to be a community of people who don't want to dual school. So you can't make these like you have to use a different school, or maybe you make it to where like they drop a better theme. So let's say like in the next world, the Life of Theme has 24 damage and 6 or 10 Pierce on it, but on that theme you can only use other school Pierce rules. That would be one way I could see, them going about it, that I think would be beneficial. Because if you use, the school that you synergize with, life being Fire, or, ice being Storm or something like that, like a school that you already get secondary damage to, you can get really good stats with just running the gear. You won't get perfect stats, like a Myth running an ice or something like that. Like, as you see a lot of Fires, let me see, I have one person specifically on my list, that did this. So as you can see, like Fire synergizes with Myth. So as you can see, he's really just running normal full Aeon gear. He's not running Myth Dealer. He has all Fire Pierce tools, and he's 163 Myth damage. This is not something that Life can do or Ice can do without just going full mono. So what I'm hoping to see in the future of, this update, as they try to push this out, is more gear tailored towards dual schooling. Now, whether that means, gear with really high secondary and main damage, so maybe a wand that has, 28 Fire and 28 life damage or something like that, would be really interesting. Something with maybe more Pierce, because Pierce is like the biggest thing. Pierce is just as important as damage, if not more. So that's another big issue. Another issue with dual schooling specifically is critical. Now, as you can see, with the way the pins work, you have two options for your sword pins if you're dual schooling. You have a option with damage and pierce, or you have an option with damage and crit. Now, same goes back to what I said earlier, is if you use the damage and crit, you're missing out on pierce, and pierce is just as important as damage. And if you run all the pierce, you're having no critical, so you completely, have no chance of criticaling, and even if you do crit, it's like a 0.05 multiplier. So it's not worth it at that point. So this is another thing I really hope that they, can address in the future is, reworking maybe some gear to where you can get critical, universal critical maybe, or something to incentivize dual schooling with anything. Because right now, if you're trying to dual school on a school that has, without secondary, so like I'm on a life, right? If I wanted to dual school with Storm, for example, I'm kind of forced to run this Athame. Now, I get the 16 universal damage, which is really good, but as you can see, I'm losing almost, 900 HP. I'm losing out on, 70 block almost, and a lot of other stats just to be able to run damage. So, no other strategy except for the school that you actually have synergy with, with your secondary damage, is viable right now in ranked. And we already know that they are pushing for dual schooling. So I think one of the biggest steps to be able to do this without just making everyone dual school with the same school is by offering more options in the next world or in the next raid that will allow you to pick what school you want to duel with. So like schools like Life, for example, I'll give you, I can dual school with Death, Storm, Myth, Fire, Balance. I believe that is, honestly, I might be wrong here. Someone correct me. I'm pretty sure you can dual school with any school. I think every school gets those damage pins, but you only get viable stats if you dual school with the synergy school. So big thing I hope they change in the future, maybe with the raids or the next world. They already made one very needed change, which is in test storm right now, is you will be able to train every school's scions. So now schools, like if you want to dual school with fire, you can use Spellamented Elf in main deck or side deck to set up your scion. So being able to set up scions will, open up the gap completely on what you can do. You're not forced to just using, spellamented spells, and it'll bring up a lot of interesting strategies. Some people will be using, Life or Shambo to set up a Storm Scion or something like that. Really, all it does is it will open up to where you're not forced to just play one way on every school, and pretty much every school is going to play differently, which is a positive. Now, I do understand, obviously, coming from the perspective of a legacy player, some people do not want this. They like, okay, why would I make an ice, or why would I make a storm when I can just go on my ice and get better stats than a storm? Which is a big concern, and I hope that that's something they will address by, maybe universalizing stats to where, an ice using storm will have an advantage like health maybe, but a storm using ice, will have the advantage of maybe you get, you just get better spells or you get the shads. Now, I do think that one way they should go about shads, because not having the shadow spells being able to be trainable for every school, or at least in the TC version, is kind of a lame towards this strategy. But one way I could see them addressing this is changing the spellmental paths for shads again, which I know is like, oh my god, another spellmental shad change. But one way I could see about this is maybe instead of just having a PvP and a PvE path, you have it to where the base shad is something that could be universally good. So something like this, something like dogs being a pacify. But, as you move on here, you have the ability to go further into the life. So obviously other schools will not be able to spellment the shads, but the base shad will be something that be beneficial for everyone. Assuming that they bring minions back, obviously, because this is not useful right now. But, stuff like that. So being able to change the spellmental paths to where, they're usable. So the TC shadow spells will be the base shad. So for example, like, I believe... I guess I don't have any shad spells, but you know what I'm talking about. Like every school will be able to use the base shad for something in their synergy, and then the spellmental path will be only for the school that will, directly affect their spells and stuff like that. That is something I hope that they also do in the future. But as of right now, it is extremely unfinished, the dual school update, because it takes an entire rework of the game itself. But I am hoping that they do figure it out very soon, so that this change can actually affect PvP and maybe make it a little bit less stale. Because right now we are kind of stuck, and dual schooling itself right now is not viable at all in ranked. So if you guys have any other comments or questions on this subject, feel free to drop a comment or DM me directly on Discord, and I will see you guys in the next one.